So I bought an almost 10-year-old cinema camera for my video work in 2022, and that is the Canon C100 Mark I, the original. And this is a camera that has some features that modern hybrid cameras still wish they had, but also lacks some features that more modern, even entry-level cameras have now. So I'm going to talk about why I bought this camera for my work in 2022, what it does so well and why that works so well for my video work, and whether or not that might fit into what you do and what you need, and if that could be a good purchase for you. Alright, so first off, the specs for this camera, and I will say this part is going to be pretty short and on paper not even that sweet, but don't skip the video just from hearing the specs on this camera. Hear me out. So it does have a native 4K sensor, but it only downsamples and outputs a 1080 video file. And that 1080 is only at 8-bit 420. And it does also come with C-Log, but it only comes with C-Log 1. To be fair there, C-Log 1 is definitely the best option for 8-bit footage because C-Log 1 works pretty well with 8-bit footage, and the other flavors of C-Log are a bit too aggressive on the curve, and you're not going to be able to do very well with those on 8-bit footage. It also only films 24 or 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in a PAL region, and it didn't actually originally ship with dual pixel autofocus, but there was then a paid upgrade feature for dual pixel autofocus. So when you're looking on the used market, a lot of the C100s are going to have the dual pixel autofocus upgrade, but with that dual pixel autofocus, it only has autofocus in the center box of the frame, so there's no tracking or anything like that, or any other autofocus options there. And again, I do have the C100 Mark I version, and there was a C100 Mark II that came out 2 years later, and it has a few more features and upgrades than this. So now when it comes to ergonomics and usability, this is where the camera does start to shine. And to start off, the kind of brain of the camera is pretty small and light and actually easily able to use with some handheld gimbal setups. And it does also have the ability to be kind of built up with the included hand grip and the handle. And they also add functionality to the camera. So the hand grip is actually pretty necessary for regular use and control of the camera because the joystick that's on the hand grip is really the only way to access most of the menu and even change some of the basic settings on the camera. And then the top handle also adds 2 XLR inputs that allow you to record audio straight to the camera. And these XLR inputs can also output phantom power. And this gives you the ability to use more professional grade mics and just makes the audio options with this camera a lot more versatile. And an XLR input is much higher quality and a lot more versatile than a standard 1/4-inch mic jack that you would have on like a mirrorless or a DSLR camera, though this C100 also has a 1/4-inch mic jack, and that mic jack is actually directly on the body, so you can use that even if you don't have the top handle. And one of the biggest advantages with this camera is that it has built-in ND filters, so you don't have to worry about having variable ND filters that you have to screw on any of your lenses. You don't have to worry about what the size of the lens filter is or anything like that because it's in the camera behind the lens, and whatever lens you put on this camera, it's going to work with that. Now, it isn't a variable ND. It has hard stops at 2, 4, and 6 stops of ND, but this is such a game changer for, especially when you're filming outdoors or where you have a lot of available light and sunlight, and being able to dial in your exposure exactly where you need it. It also has a ton of buttons and controls on the camera, and all of the buttons can actually be customized to different custom functions from what they were originally assigned with right out of the box. But for instance, there is a zebra button, and that allows you to control the zebras in this camera, and this camera is able to have 2 different levels of zebras, and you can also program the levels at which those zebras show up as well. There's also a peaking button to turn focus peaking on and off, and a waveform monitor button, and this camera has a waveform monitor for exposure and an edge monitor for focus. And the waveform monitor is something that most mirrorless and DSLR cameras don't have included, but it's a much more reliable way to check your exposure and see where the levels of exposure on your shot are falling. There's also a button for controlling your white balance and a button for automatically setting custom white balance, which is super easy and super useful. Wherever you are filming, all you need to do is hold up a gray card, or if you don't have one, just point at a white wall and hit the custom white balance, and it'll automatically set it to the right Kelvin temperature for that scene. There's a scroll wheel that you can dial in your aperture with. There's also a button for auto iris or auto aperture that's going to, based on the exposure, set your aperture at where it would need to be, or where at least the camera thinks it needs to be to get the right exposure. It also has a button to change your ISO settings and a button to change your shutter. And the cool thing about the shutter settings is this camera is you can do shutter speed just like you would on a photo camera or a hybrid camera, but you can also do shutter angle. And with shutter angle, for instance, with my camera, I just have it set to 180 degrees, and that's going to automatically dial in exactly 180 degree shutter based on whatever frame rate I'm shooting at. So for 24 frames, that's going to be 48th shutter, and for 30 frames per second, that's going to be 1/60. There's also a button on the front of the camera for one-shot autofocus, so if you don't want to be using continuous autofocus, you can just hit that button whenever you need to, and it will automatically focus on whatever is in that autofocus box in the center of the frame. Then we have 3 record buttons total on this camera, one on the front on the body itself, on the side grip, and then one on the top handle. And on the body there is also a magnify button on the actual body of the camera, and then one that is set to magnify on the side grip. On the top handle we have audio controls so that you can manually dial in your audio, and the cool thing about this is you can also do it on the fly as you're recording. So if you need to turn up the levels or turn down the levels, you can do it smoothly with the dial. You can also set it to which inputs you're using, whether it's XLR or 1/4 inch or the built-in stereo microphone that is on the handle itself as well. But again, those mics are built into the top handle of this camera, and if you're not using the top handle, there are no built-in mics for scratch audio on the camera body itself. But back to the top handle, we do also have a cold mount as well as an extra 1/4-20 mount on the top of the handle for mounting extra accessories, for extra mics if you want to do a cold shoe mic, or with the 1/4-20 mount, that would be a cool option for if you're using an easy rig or something as well. So as far as ports go, we do have a headphone port, we have a remote port, a USB port, HDMI port. We also have a DC power port so that you can power the camera through wall power, so that you don't have to worry about batteries and recharging and switching them in and out if you're doing longer takes of something. And then there is also like a really old school AV out port so that you can connect it to an older TV that has like the yellow, red, and white plugs, but that's probably not so useful now. The back screen on this camera has a resolution of 0.922 megapixels, and that's certainly not the greatest screen or the highest resolution, although I do think it is pretty usable still. It does rotate, but it has limited rotation, so it's really good if you are behind the camera using it. You can use it from looking straight back at the camera, or holding the camera lower, you can flip the screen up towards you, or if you're even holding the camera higher, you can flip the screen down to see it from that angle. But it's not going to give you any angles to see the screen from in front of the camera or even from the sides of the camera either. The EVF is 1.555 megapixels, which sounds better than the screen, but it's definitely not. It's also very small inside of the EVF. The magnification in there is not really good at all, and I do think that it can be used for checking your framing in a pinch, but I would definitely not use it for manual focus or anything like that. And it also doesn't show any of the settings or exposure tools or anything like that in the EVF, just the framing in the picture that it's seeing. One thing about this camera is being able to review the clips that you have recorded, and the only way to really thoroughly do that is to switch it into media mode. And in order to do that, you have to turn the camera off and then to media mode, and it does take a few seconds to turn the camera on and off, so that is going to take some time if you're trying to review on sets. And there is an option, there's a button set to automatically review the last clip that you recorded, but when you do it through that button, which is available while you're in camera mode, but while you're reviewing it through that button, it doesn't play any audio at all. So if you want to be able to review more than just the last clip or review any of the clips with audio, you have to switch it into media mode. And like I said, that will take several seconds to switch into media mode and then several seconds to switch back into camera mode to be able to record again after that. As far as batteries, this camera uses the BP9 series of batteries. So it came originally with the BP955 battery, and with that battery you can get over 3 hours of record time, and then you can use something like the BP-975 battery that's larger to get even more battery life. So battery life with this camera is pretty great. So video, and this is a video camera, so that's all it does, which means that it is designed specifically for recording video and to do that well, and it does it well. Again, it does not record 4K, which for some people might make it seem like this camera automatically is useless, but there's a few reasons why not recording 4K in the camera is not actually going to be bad for some cases. So first of all, if you're wanting 4K because of perceived image quality in 4K, first of all, it's a misconception that 4K equates to better image quality, but this camera does have a 4K sensor, so it is recording 4K, but it is then downsampling it and outputting it at 1080. So you are getting 4K image quality in a 1080 file. Another factor when not having the 4K output is not going to be a disadvantage for you is if your output is for delivery to social media, YouTube, some kind of web delivery, because 4K for those instances is really just a waste of space. Because of the way compression works, you're not going to see any benefit from actually filming in 4K if your delivery is to those platforms. For YouTube specifically, a little hack to get around that and still get 4K videos on your channel is to film in 1080 as long as you have access to a camera with good quality 1080, and then edit and export that then into a 4K file and upload the 4K file. The way compression works, again, you're not going to lose any quality from what you would have gotten if you filmed in 4K to start with. And then it's not going to be a downside to not having 4K files output from this camera if you don't have a specific requirement to deliver in 4K. And I'll say it's not super usual that you do have that specific resolution requirement for projects. Typically, clients don't have any idea what kind of resolution they want, let alone what kind of resolution they need. Typically, they just want you to deliver something that looks quality and looks professional. And it is still very normal to have a 1080p output. And it's really up to you to find out what the client needs, where they're going to be using it, what they're going to be using it for, and see what the best output and what the best resolution for them as far as what they're going to be using is going to be. And especially if, again, they're using their videos on their social or for their YouTube channel or some kind of web delivery, which, let's be honest, a lot of the work that we're doing now is going to be on the web, and a lot of it, that's going to be its primary use as well. So in that case, it is absolutely fine, and for you probably more profitable to output 1080 because then you're not wasting all that space in filming 4K. Now there could be some downsides to not filming a 4K file, and if you're one of those videographers that's just terrible at framing and always has to fix their framing in post by cropping in, you're not going to have the same amount of resolution in your files to crop in and fix your bad framing. But if that's you, maybe you should work on your framing a little bit anyway. Also, if you do have a project that does have a specific resolution requirement and actually does need 4K, obviously you don't have that with this because it only outputs the 1080 file. But I mean, if you're doing professional video work on a regular basis, how often is it that you have actually been required to have a 4K output for that project? And when you don't specifically need to film to 4K, again, you're saving tons of space and therefore money because the file sizes are so much smaller. And while we're talking about that, the file sizes from this camera are tiny, and a 32 gig card can get you like 3.5 hours of footage on this camera, which is ridiculous. Now, the files are in AVC HD file format, and that's not my favorite. They also have a really low bit rate of like 24 megabits per second, and I would have been typically dismissive of something with a bit rate that low, and honestly, I was dismissive of the C100 for exactly that reason for a long time, until I actually got the C100 and started trying it and filming with it. And despite being tiny and having that low bit rate, the footage actually holds up really well and looks really nice. And again, files are super tiny, so it's going to take up way less space. And theoretically, the AVC HD is going to be better for audio quality versus something like MP4. So for me, what it's going to be used for and what it's going to be really great for is stuff like documentary interviews, YouTube where I'm sitting and talking to the camera for a long time, and also just any kind of talking head that I'm filming. So let's talk about the image quality with this camera. And first of all, it does have, again, C-Log, just C-Log 1, but C-Log 1 is really great for 8-bit footage, which this has, and that's going to capture the most dynamic range. So I would definitely suggest on the C100 use C-Log. That's going to get you the most dynamic range, the most flexibility with colors. You are going to be limited because it is 8-bit footage on how much flexibility you have with colors there. And I have seen a lot of people on YouTube actually say that you should just film in wide DR, and I definitely disagree with that because the idea is, well, you don't have to color grade as much, but C-Log is going to give you more flexibility with your colors and your dynamic range. And if you don't know how to color grade enough to color grade C-Log, C-Log is a really easy color grading workflow, and you can get to the colors that you want really quickly and really easily. If you aren't able to do that, I would suggest save your money. Don't spend it on a more higher end camera or more expensive camera. Stick with the camera that you have, whether that's an entry level camera or whatever it is, and maybe invest your money into some courses or training to learn how to color grade before you start getting into cameras that are going to really need you to color grade in order to get their full potential out of them. But when you are filming and grading that C-Log, the colors look really nice. The image looks great, and the 4K sensor outputting this 1080 file looks really detailed and really sharp. And honestly, this 1080 looks a lot better than even some of the more modern 4K from mirrorless cameras and hybrid cameras that are out there now. And the colors off of this sensor are really nice and pleasing, especially for anyone who enjoys the Canon color science. I will say you definitely need to make sure that you're getting the right white balance, which is not a problem because of the custom white balance settings in this camera. You should definitely be hitting your white balance pretty much spot on every single time, and you're going to want to make sure that you are doing that because, again, you only have 8-bit 420 footage here, so you're not going to want to be pushing the Kelvin temperature in post too far in any direction in order to fix that, because then the footage will start to degrade. But even with just a simple color grade, the colors look really nice and you can get there really quickly and really easily. But I wanted to do a moire test and see how this sensor held up with that, so I'm going to change quickly and we'll do a moire test. I've heard honestly only one person complain about this, but I did hear the one complaint about moire from a commenter on YouTube somewhere. And so I wanted to do a test, and if you aren't familiar, moire is an effect basically with patterns like this that have a lot of detail and different things going on. The camera sensor can have trouble recording all that detail, and then it can result in really funky, weird patterns that it actually shows up on the video. So if moire is an issue with this camera, then you will see, especially with this pattern on my shirt being as much of the frame as it is here, then you will probably see issues. So we'll look at that and then be able to make an opinion. So now looking back at that footage, it handles moire actually really well, and I have no idea where that comment about it not handling it well came from, because they probably hadn't used the C100 and seen the footage. I don't think that moire is going to be an issue at all with this camera based on what I've seen so far. Now when we get to frame rates, this camera is not in any way a slow motion camera. It technically does have a 60i option, but the workflow for getting that to even look usable in a 24 frames per second timeline is probably not worth it for what's probably not going to be that great looking anyway. So for me, the reason I even got this was for an A-roll camera. So talking head, sit down interviews like I've mentioned before, and not for slow motion work. And then I want to talk about ND filters, and you might think that ND filters are not necessarily part of the image quality discussion directly, but it definitely is, because again, these ND filters are built in. So regardless of what lens you put on this camera, you have the option to use these ND filters. And that allows, first of all, for the ability to dial in your exposure, even again when you're outdoors in bright sunlight or something like that. But because these are built in, and because these were designed by the camera manufacturer, they were designed to work with the sensor itself. So you're going to not get issues with color cast or having to fix the artifacts in the colors that the ND filter left on the sensor because of using a maybe less expensive external ND filter or something like that. Now, the ND filters are also pretty necessary, especially if you're filming outdoors when you're filming in C-Log, which again you should be, because the native ISO for C-Log on this camera is ISO 850, and that's a little bit brighter. And so when you're outdoors, you're definitely going to need to use the ND filters. Now it only goes up to 6 stops, but the 2, 4, and 6 in hard stops are really useful for nailing in exactly the exposure that you need to get for the shot and getting a really beautiful shot. Now, while we're on the topic of exposure, this camera has some really cool exposure tools built into it. And the first thing is that it does have zebras and 2 levels of zebras that you can turn on, and those levels are customizable as well. So for instance, for me, I have the first level of zebras at 75%, and that's a good area to look at to see if on skin tones, the highlights are hitting right at 75%, so I'm seeing clipping just in the highlights on skin tones. Then I feel fairly confident that the exposure is pretty correct for those skin tones. And then I have the other set to 100%, so if I start to see the second level of zebras, then I know that something is clipping there. But zebras, while nice, they're not the most accurate way to get exposure. They're also pretty common now, or more common I would say, in especially more higher end and prosumer mirrorless and DSLR cameras as well. But in addition to that, this camera has the option to use a waveform monitor, and that's a much more accurate way to check your exposure than just watching to see where your highlights fall and making sure that nothing is clipping. And again, the usability of this camera is what makes the camera so good. So when we're talking about video, it has the built-in XLR inputs to this camera on the top handle. And yes, we're talking about video, but really for video quality, the audio quality is actually much more important than the image quality. So being able to use more professional mics and having more versatility with what mics you can use and how many mics you can use on this camera is a huge factor and makes a big difference over filming with your mirrorless camera. And then again, all of the customizable buttons and controls on this camera, and all of the settings and even the exposure tools and things that you're using with this camera, you can change that on the fly as you're filming, which just makes it much more easy to use and versatile, especially in run and gun situations where you're having to change audio or different settings on even exposure on the fly. But a huge hit to the versatility and usability of this camera is the autofocus in the camera. And again, the reason that I would say it's a hit to versatility is because you're only able to use an autofocus box in the center of the frame. And I will say that the autofocus is, when you get that dual pixel autofocus upgrade, if that's with the camera that you buy or you upgrade that, it is reliable, the autofocus performance in that box. But again, it's only in that box. So that is definitely limiting as far as framing and focusing on things that aren't directly in the middle of the frame. But for a lot of handheld shots that I do, I use a center autofocus box paired with the AF lock anyway. So I have the AF lock customized to the button that is on the side hand grip of this camera. And then what I'll do is I will have the center box focus on whatever it is that I'm trying to have the shot focus on, and then start moving from there. And anytime that something comes in front of what I want to be focused on, I can hit the AF lock button and keep it from changing focus. And if I move so that whatever I want to be in focus is not in the center of the frame, I can just hit that button again and it'll stay focused where it was. And I, again, also use that even on mirrorless cameras when I don't want to use tracking, especially if I don't want to only be focused on one thing and want to move around and potentially change the focus slightly during the shot. That's going to be the method that I use anyway, so I think it still is usable in a lot of situations, but again, definitely less versatile than the autofocus systems that we have in more modern cameras. And I will say, with the autofocus performance that this camera has, I do think that it would definitely be usable for gimbal work as long as you're able to keep whatever you're trying to focus on in the center of the frame. But if it's some kind of thing that moves really quickly and erratically and will be in different spots of the frame, then that will definitely be a struggle. So who's this camera for? And first of all, I would not suggest this for a beginner. This, I think you need to at least be somewhat comfortable with manual focus and basic color grading, and also have a basic understanding of getting the right exposure and white balance in camera. And honestly, I see kind of a pretty specific use case for this camera right now, and that is for someone who needs great quality, long form video with good audio, small file sizes, and a pretty quick turnaround workflow that's not going to have huge storage and media costs and doesn't have a 4K requirement for filming. And this camera is also not for someone who needs slow motion, or at least not for someone who needs slow motion from this camera. So for instance, for me, I have the R6, and the R6 is my camera for my slow motion shots anytime that I do need a shot to specifically be in 4K. It's also for shots where I don't have a couple seconds to get the camera set up and turned on and wait for it to be ready to shoot. The R6, of course, also has IBIS, which the C100 doesn't have, because that's not really something that cinema cameras do. And so I can use the R6 for those more steady handheld shots. Although, to be fair, the C100, because of its bigger size and having a little bit more weight, definitely more weight than like a mirrorless camera, you are able to get steadier handheld shots. And especially if you have a lens that has image stabilization built into the lens or something like that, you can get decently stable shots with the C100, and that's going to have a different look than stabilized shots with in-body image stabilization system as well. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like. If you have any questions about this camera and how or why I'm using it, or any thoughts about the camera and how I'm using it, feel free to put it in the comments below. If you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button and then hit the bell icon so that you can get notified when I put out new videos on this channel. If you are interested in any of the gear that I've talked about in this video, in the description down below, I will have affiliate links so that at no extra cost to you, if you purchase through those links, you can help to support this channel so that I can continue to make video for you. Thanks. See ya.